Good evening. I'm Ayşe Çağlar. I'm a permanent fellow at IWM, and I'm a professor also at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, University of Vienna. A very warm welcome to all of you to our discussion of the book Sites of Statelessness, Laws, Cities, Seas, which is co-edited by Sabyasachi Basu Ray Chaudhury, Ranabir Samaddar, and myself. We are pleased to be not only all the editors to be here present in this book event, but also two prominent scholars on urban and migration studies, Paolo Novak and Yuri Kazepov. Paolo Novak from SOAS and Yuri Kazepov from University of Vienna. The book came at the very end of 2024 from SUNY Press, but you would be wondering why that we are doing it so late. But as you see that we were being scattered around the continents, it was not possible to organize all of us being in the same place to have the book talk. What am I going to do is that I will introduce the participants first, briefly, and afterwards I will say a couple of words about the intellectual and the political spirit behind this volume. Then afterwards I would give the floor to my co-editors, and then the Yuri Kazepov and Paolo Novak for their commentary and questions. Let me start first with Sabyasachi Basu Ray Chaudhury, and I'm gonna go with the first names afterwards. First, this is with the formal one, but he's a professor in the Department of Political Science, Rabindra Bharati University, Calcutta, and is the president of the Calcutta Research Group in India. He was also the vice chancellor of Rabindra Bharati University, Calcutta from 2012 to 2023. His areas of research interest is global politics, South Asian politics, migration and refugee studies, human rights, and sociology of labor. Sabyasachi is a very prolific writer, and for everyone, I will be just to mentioning a couple of titles without going into is this co-authored, co-edited, or single-authored and that. But a number of publications, the titles are Rohingya in South Asia, The People Without a State, Rights After Globalization, and Internal Displacement in South Asia, The Relevance of UN Guiding Principles. These are just some kind of titles. On my right is Ranabir Samaddar. He's currently the Distinguished Chair in Migration and Forced Migration Studies, Calcutta Research Group in Calcutta, India, and he's also a CIFAR Fellow. CIFAR is a Canadian-based global research institution. He's considered as one of the foremost theorists, not terrorists. Theorists in the field of migration and forced migration studies. I like to being the terrorist, actually. His writings on migration, forms of labor, urbanization, and political struggles have been hailed to have given a new turn in post-colonial thinking, and rightly so. Among his influential works are The Marginal Nation, Transborder Migration from Bangladesh to West Bengal, Karl Marx and the postcolonial age. Postcolonial age of migration. Many of my students know it quite well, I think. Migrants and the neoliberal city, and the pandemic and the politics of life. Both Sabyasachi and Ranabir have been fellows at IWM. And Paolo Novak is a senior lecturer in development studies at SOAS, University of London, and is a visiting fellow at IWM, and sadly until only the end of this month. His research examines how the global and intimate dynamics of borders, migration, and development are contingently reproduced and contested in specific settings. His work draws on feminist and postcolonial spatial theory to analyze contested geographies and territorial formations. His recent book, Buildings of Refuge, develops the concept of the postcoloniality of asylum infrastructure to intervene in debates on EU borders and the so-called European migration crisis. IWM fellows will be hearing about that more next Monday, actually. His publications also appeared in very prominent journals like Geopolitics, Political Geography, and Critical Sociology. Last but not the least, Yuri Kazepov is a professor of urban sociology at the Department of Sociology, University of Vienna. He served as the president of the Research Committee 21 on Urban and Regional Studies of the International Sociological Association between 2010 and 2014. He's bringing actually the 2026 meeting of RC21 to Vienna this summer. I have the honor of co-directing the research platform on urban futures at the University of Vienna with him. His research interests address the territorial dimension of social policies in a comparative perspective, embedding the urban in multi-level governance arrangements, and on comparative urban research in Europe. And he had conducted extensive research on environmental and sustainability policies, social innovation, housing, social assistance schemes, and migration. His publications include Vienna, Still a Just City, and Handbook on Urban Social Policy, International Perspectives on Multi-Level Governance and Local Welfare. Both came in 2022. I have the honor of having worked with all the participants of this event within and beyond IWM. And I have to say that the book, that the Sites of Statelessness, grew out of our collaboration and the Europe-Asia Research Platform on Forced Migration, which was a collaboration between IWM and CRG. And I was the anchoring point here at IWM, and Ranabir and Sabyasachi were at the CRG and the Calcutta end. And several publications actually came out of that. The digitized migrants is almost all except one article, all of them appeared in a special issue. So let me tell you about that, a little bit about the the institutional collaboration and the intellectual collaboration was behind this book. But despite several conventions trying to prohibit it, statelessness in our contemporary world is not only a persisting phenomenon, but an increasing number of people are subject to process of statelessness. Often identified as a legal anomaly, statelessness is mostly framed as a consequence of state succession. And exactly an unease with this kind of a legal understanding of statelessness was the driving force behind this volume. So we were very much situated actually against this kind of a legal understanding of statelessness. Rather than looking in laws and conventions for the definition of statelessness, we focused in the desire for this volume was realized, we focused on the processes through which statelessness is produced historically and structurally. And we aimed, and I think we succeeded to explore how statelessness is being produced across multiple sites, specifically law, city, and sea. And in most also important that in exploring how people are made stateless, showing those processes across these states, we did not take those states as just mere backdrops, as like the tapestry, but as active arenas where statelessness is generated, managed, and reproduced through distinct actors, institutions, and practices. One's approach from this perspective, that is to say, not as a simple legal condition, but as an outcome of historically, socially, and politically produced processes, understanding statelessness necessarily urges us to engage with colonialism, colonial rule, colonial logics and techniques of governance, postcoloniality and decolonization. But above all, it urges us to engage with the nation-building projects and processes. As indicated in our introduction, what lies at the bottom of these processes is the efforts to align the right population with the right territory. That is very clear in our introduction too. That is why statelessness is very much connected and in fact structurally embedded into the nation-building processes and gets closely entangled with the logics of citizenship. So when you're dealing with statelessness, actually you're dealing with also citizenship. And similar to this, our desire to go beyond the binary of legal and illegal, this volume also takes a very relational perspective, understanding of citizenship and statelessness, rather than seeing them as a binary. As Sabyasachi nicely puts in his chapter, the history of statelessness emerges as the shadow history of citizenship itself. So, unfortunately, our contemporary world provides series of examples where the boundary between citizen and stateless is increasingly blurred. We just need to think about increasing practice of stripping citizenship rights, or say deportation regimes which disregard citizenship rights, and we could see how that is happening very often. As documented in the book, contemporary European states actively produce statelessness through legal and political practices, particularly in the context of counterterrorism and national security. They increasingly use citizenship deprivation as a security tool and actively blur the line between criminal punishment and political exclusion. If you are reading the newspapers around all the politics in different parts of the world, especially in Europe, you will immediately hit this dilemma. So most importantly, in these practices, racialized and migration-based hierarchies of citizenship are in play. While the naturalized citizens could end up being stateless in these processes, the citizens by birth are largely protected. But of course, there are lots of variations about that. So contemporary statelessness in Europe is structurally produced through securitization and by judicial means. I'm not going to go in terms of that, so that you could buy the book and then read about how that happens in cities and how it happens in seas, that kind of those processes of statelessness unfold. But I will add, before giving the word to Sabyasachi and Ranabir first, I would like to add that the volume not only that it is explores the historical and structural processes of statelessness across multiple sites, but also addresses these processes in their entanglements both in Asia and Europe. So, and it is not about that in Europe that is particularly different in the statelessness and how that is in Asia, but it is how apart from this particular take on statelessness, beyond a legal definition of it, a legal understanding of it, I think this aspect of this book is makes it a special one, and as I underlined before, it grew out of our collaboration within Europe-Asia platform on forced migration. So I will first give the floor to Sabyasachi to expand on it, and I will throw, but before that, I mean, you are completely free to pick it up or not, two questions about that. In terms of that, Sabyasachi has a chapter also in the volume, and one is about that he has a very, you have a very strong position about seeing statelessness as a crisis of post-colonial global politics, and you call also for decolonizing the epistemologies of statelessness and urge us to go beyond the colonial and Eurocentric models of sovereignty and citizenship. I would like to also, after, I mean, have you however you expand on the book, how would this, I would like to hear a little bit more, maybe for our audience who hadn't read the book and who will read the book hopefully. How would this look like, that kind of a going beyond the colonial and Eurocentric models of sovereignty, and what is to be done to achieve this? So we started with the terrorism, we could finish with Lenin in practice.
Thank you, Ayşe. In fact, I will begin with the questions put to me by Ayşe, in the sense that, first of all, we have to, if we look at the South Asian situation, because as Ayşe has rightly pointed out, that this book is a product of the collaboration on the basis of the platform, Europe-Asia Research Platform on Migration, Forced Migration Studies. And we have seen from our work, which was primarily done during the COVID period, the pandemic period, and we were interacting with one another back and forth through emails and other means. So what we noticed that in Europe, why some of us have identified that the definition of statelessness, the legal mechanisms, even the international legal mechanisms, they seem to be more Eurocentric, in the sense that after the Second World War, this crisis, this situation of statelessness emerged in a particular context. And if we try to understand the issue of statelessness in South Asia, which is quite prevalent now, we'll notice that most of the South Asian states, they were decolonized around after the Second World War. And at that period of time, after decolonization, which may be seen as a liberating process, but it did not remain so, in the sense that the Indian subcontinent was partitioned. The two states emerged, India and Pakistan. Pakistan was again divided, and Bangladesh emerged in 1971. So when these states, post-colonial states, emerged, they tried to have a national identity, because the leaders, the political leadership, they started imagining that some kind of a national unity would be important. And in order to imagine that nation, they started, creating majorities and minorities on the basis of religious or ethnic identities. And therefore, within these post-colonial states, very soon we started noticing that there were, some internal aliens, in the sense that the people who have been living in a particular territorial space for a long time, suddenly, the new citizenship laws or the amendment of the existing laws that really excluded a group of people on the basis of their religious or ethnic identities. And therefore, this kind of exclusion is quite important. And what we, attempted to make out that usually the law is the protection mechanism, one of the major protection mechanisms for the people, for the citizens. But here, how the laws have been used as a tool for, excluding people from this domain of citizenship, from this framework of citizenship. So this book tells us, it highlights not only, as Ayşe has mentioned, it is not only about statelessness and citizenship. It is also about, physical and psychological belonging and its contestation with the legal belonging, and also unbelonging in a sense. Therefore, this contestation is important in post-colonial societies like South Asia. And as I have argued in this book, in other words, in case of Europe, which we have borrowed also in South Asia and in different parts of the world, that it is not the nation state. It is rather, according to me, is the idea of state nation. Because here the state emerged first through the transfer of power from the colonial to the post-colonial, and then the state started, having a process of nation building on the basis of religion or ethnic identity or something else. So this is a problem. Coming to the second question about what we intend to see, what some of us have argued is that, so far the international legal framework, it has shown us that why it is Eurocentric, because it emerged, this international legal framework emerged at a certain, temporal and spatial context. So it talks about universality, as if there is only one world. So what we have argued that if we look at the situation across the globe, compare, say, Europe with South Asia, we'll find that it is pluriversal. There are plural worlds, more than one worlds. And if we try to identify different experiences, the nuances, the lived experiences of the people, lived experiences of the stateless population, then probably we will find how this issue of statelessness can be addressed. So there is a need for, epistemic democratization, which we have also mentioned as, decolonizing this existing idea of statelessness. Because colonialism is no more there in a way. But as Ayşe has mentioned, that even the racism may not be in that way, but coloniality and raciality, it remains even in the post-colonial situations. And therefore, it is important. As we have also tried to indicate that when we have compared, I'm primarily focusing on the site of law, in the sense that we have 3 essays there. So in those essays, we find that in Europe and in South Asia, there is something common. That is a contestation between the rights, the human rights, the basic rights, the fundamental rights on the one hand, and on the other, the question of national security. And this is due to the securitization of migration and refugees all over the world for several reasons. I'm not going into that. And in case of South Asia, the situation is different. If we take the example, we don't have time, but just very briefly, if we take the example of Bhutan, when the new citizenship law was enacted in 1982, and interestingly, in the same year, Myanmar also had the new citizenship law. And these excluded, in case of Bhutan, the people of Nepali origin who went to Bhutan during the colonial period for cultivation and for other work. And on the other hand, in Myanmar, the Rohingya, the Muslim population, Myanmar is primarily a Buddhist majority state. So here the Rohingyas have been living there for quite some time, and suddenly they were excluded from this framework of citizenship in Myanmar. And this really excluded these people and made them stateless. And now we have at least more than 1 million refugees, come stateless people, Rohingyas, in Bangladesh. One more instance is when the Citizenship Act of India was amended in 2019. There also, the Muslim population, they were in a way excluded, from this kind of framework, which says that the people coming from the neighboring countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka was not mentioned, Afghanistan. So the people who are Hindus, who are Buddhists, who are otherwise, there was no mention of the Muslims. So if they could come to India, they would be granted citizenship. So all these stories primarily tells the situation, how the colonial laws, how the colonial mechanisms have been used in South Asia to exclude people from the framework of citizenship. And this is the reason, without taking the legal definitions of statelessness, without going into the distinction between jus soli and jus sanguinis, we have tried to find out how the process of statelessness that emerges. Ayşe, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I have the microphone. So, okay, let me just then go to Ranabir, and I will do the same. That is, you could expand or pick any point in terms of the book that you would like to expand on. But let me throw also a question in terms of the increasing relevance of this topic globally. And actually, since we have started the book and then thinking about it, that it became more and more acquired a kind of a relevance. Unfortunately, that we are seeing so many examples of that production of statelessness. And so would you like to, and especially also looking from the Asia also, whether you see as a kind of this increasing relevance that we see and globally too, and maybe the kind of conceptual and political implications of looking at statelessness in this way, because it is not simply a conceptual exercise, that looking at statelessness as a process, as being structural and then historical kind of a process, but embedded in very different, across different sides, but it has, looking at statelessness beyond legal definitions might have serious political implications too, in relation to people's solidarities or subjectivities. But that is besides, if you wish to, you could take them up, but you're free to pick up any point in terms of the book. Do you need this, or do you have yours?
No, I think it is recorded.
Yes.
Thank you, Ayşe. I'm very happy to come here and participate in the book discussion. I remember possibly a year before COVID began, and Ayşe, you moderated the session, and I was giving a talk on Rohingyas, and we had a discussion on the statelessness.
Yes, but I was not part of IWM at that time, I think.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So I was thinking when you were telling, and Sabyasachi expanded on that, that in these years, whether the magnitude of statelessness has increased globally, or does it remain the same? And Ayşe, you were right in posing the question that is it increasing, and if it is increasing, so what is the dimension, etc. And thanks for raising this question. We seem to think alike. Thank you. Now, you see, I will not mince words. I will say very clearly that we are late in recognizing or acknowledging the question of statelessness inbuilt in nation making, but, and this is where I shall not mince my words, that it is in the democracy, the whole idea of democracy itself. There is a very good book by Pierre Rosanvallon, the French historian, and the name of the book is Counter Democracy. And even though Rosanvallon does not include, citizenship and its other, so you may say the stateless is the other of citizen or the national, but the very significant point that he makes is that the birth of democracy by itself is marked by what he calls counter-democratic tendencies and institutions. And when he uses the term democratic, it's neither in a appreciative way nor in any pejorative manner, but simply indicating that democracy began as a system. He mainly refers to the French institutions, but for example, there is a interesting chapter on newspapers, that how newspapers were regarded as anti-democratic because they were constantly criticizing the democratic system, and these newspapers could be run by elites, could be run by wealthy people, could be run by poor people, etc. He also mentioned that these civil society groups, clubs in case of France, but he mentions also crowd, that crowd never appreciated democracy very much. And again, there is a book which revises the history of England and says that, for example, the Chartists, and up to 1850-60, the British poor or the English poor had never much faith in democracy. And I'm taking a slightly longer route to make my point, that if you take India, you will understand what I'm trying to say. Look, in India in 1950, the constitution making is over. And the preamble to the constitution says, we the people of India give unto ourselves, etc. Who are this we? The we is the people of India. And it is only in 1955 that the citizenship law is made. So the citizen is not making the constitution. People are making the constitution, and then the power that has been constituted by the constitution decides to streamline the idea of the citizen. So our common sense suggests that citizens make democracy, whereas you can go on taking any example from any part of the world, and you will see that framing citizenship laws and our ideas of who is a citizen is a post facto thing. I mean, think of, I think about 7 years back, just before COVID, there was a scandal in UK about the Windrush generation, where workers who had been brought from Jamaica and other West Indies countries to UK for economic regeneration of UK were sent back after 50 years to those countries. Because again, the citizenship laws were revised, in some cases those which had not been vigorously implemented. The democratic rulers decided that in the interest of democracy, aliens must be identified and all that. Take today's United States. Now, with all the vigor of President Trump, this is not the first time in US, and this will not be the last time when the drive will be on to identify who is an illegal immigrant. And while Europe is now concerned with Trump, because this is my own, evil tongue, so Europe is now concerned with Trump more because of, let us say, taxes and all that, new tariff duties. But if you think of what happened in LA nearly a year back, you can see the LA riots, where it was called the immigrant riots, happened precisely because the federal police, the immigration forces, they had to invade and they had to send out missions to factories, those industrial units, meat industrial units and all others where immigrant labor was. And now they are being pushed out. And as I said, you can be sure that the success rate will be maybe how much? 5%, 10%. So what will happen to the rest of the immigrants? They will remain, but they will not say that we demand our rights. So you do not have any history of democracy that is delinked from the nationality and citizenship question. And after democratic regimes have been set up, now, and this is periodic, it's only that we are acknowledging it much late. So this is why I said that we acknowledged it quite late, and now, of course, we are still running behind the fast pace at which statelessness is spreading. So I will limit my comment on your first thing to this, that it's a fundamental question of how you build democracy, because this is one of the challenges of democracy anywhere and everywhere. One is that Sabyasachi repeated, because democracy finally will be a question of majority. Finally, it will be a question of who is a French, who is a Dutch, who is a German, who is an Austrian, etc. There is a classic book on the 19th century cases in United States which had to decide on case after case as to who was a Mexican and who was an American of United States. And this problem exacerbated after much of the south of the United States, particularly California and all that, were included in the United States. And again, all kinds of formulas were used. if you think that you have to decide it by blood, use sanguinis, then after a point, today United States has revised everything. If you think it should be by jus soli, again you have endless revisions of that. So the problem is a global problem. Think of the French history of what they did to the Protestants through the, let's say, 300 to 400 years, at least 350 years, in terms of those who remained Protestants. So that's one. The second, I will be really short, which is that if this is a global problem, and it is important to recognize that this is a question of democracy, this is not a problem of authoritarianism. Revising citizenship laws is the, how would you put it, nasty habit of all democratic regimes. And if this is a global problem, what do we do? And what is the political, or the strategic thinking on this? And as you must have noticed, that the fundamental criticism has to be made, or has to be targeted at the heart of the problem itself. And at least a partial solution can be done where democratic regimes are not willing to give full citizenship rights to immigrants. Whether the right of the migrant labor or immigrant labor can be recognized to a greater extent. That will, I'm not saying that that will fully solve the problem, but that will be at least partly solving the problem. You see, in Hannah Arendt's thinking, there was not much difference between who was a refugee and who was a stateless. In fact, Hannah Arendt thought that refugees were stateless. And only this UNHCR politics and all that, initially even in the UNHCR thinking also and the United Nations thinking also, the two questions seem to be the same. The question of the refugee and the question of the stateless. It was only something like 5-6 years later that they thought that these were questions were different. But I think a massive mistake was done. And strategically, first of all, these notion of or the notional difference between the refugee and the stateless should be done away with. The laboring rights should be given or restored. And I still believe that when you think of the cities, massive cities, and I will end with this, that yes, this is a problem of the South, but the problem of the South, which Sabyasachi said, is a problem of South Asia or Asia, as you point out. But South is within the North itself. It's not a geopolitical division only. I mean, it is a geopolitical division, but in South you will find North. Bombay's billionaires are no less rich than the handful of US rich. And on the other hand, the southern realities within the North itself is also something which, recall Gramsci's great text about the southern question when he was writing on Naples, that Naples is the South. So we require strategic thinking, and I will end with something which, if one of our friends, Professor Paula Banerjee, if she were present, she would have probably expanded on that. And this is the last line. This is in 2015 or 16, the EU made a study, and it was published in the New York Times, a study of the sex workers in Europe. And it was found out that 60% of the sex workers in Europe were stateless. So you may come in, you may manage to lodge yourself in the heart of Europe, and you can practice sex work, but that is how you'd have to remain, through your life. And you cannot go back, because if you go back, you are either caught by the European police and again put back where you belong, or if you think that you should go back to your country of origin, then the country of origin will say, no, you don't belong to us. So for the country of origin also, it's what you may call good riddance. You have left, good for us. Don't come back.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ranabir. Now I will give the floor to Paolo for your comments, questions on the text. I am scared that it's working.
Good. Thank you. Thanks, Ayşe and everyone. I mean, it's a real pleasure to be sharing this stage with you all, with friends. I've been following the work of the Europe-Asia platform since the very beginning, and indeed the work of the three representatives of that platform even before the constitution of the platform. So I'm a fan, and I'm very happy to have been part of this project, even if tangentially. I remember being invited as a discussant in one of the draft papers, and connecting online. Indeed, it was the time of COVID. And it's a book that evokes so many thoughts for scholars like me interested in borders and migration studies. Even these two interventions. I mean, Ranabir's intervention reminded me of Balibar. You can paraphrase Balibar saying, statelessness is the undemocratic precondition for democracy to happen. Or indeed, Sabyasachi's remarks reminded me of one of the foundational texts in refugee studies by Anthony Smith in 1981 and so on. But, I thought I should perhaps flag out what to me are three broad areas of interventions of the book that go beyond my specialized interest in borders and migration, and that perhaps can engender further discussion. And the first contribution, I mean, it seems banal to say, but you learn a lot from the book. And this is no small feat nowadays. I mean, there are so many books. You read the first section, the first chapter, and personally, I just I get everything I need to get from it, and I leave the book over there. Long life, PDFs from Russian websites that you don't accumulate so much paper. Here, the book keeps on giving, and it's very good. It's so detailed. It takes you in a sort of I would tend to call it a kind of spatio-temporal galloping. From the very first sentence, you have Dhaka, Lima, Lesbos, Calais, all brought into play simultaneously in what I would call our coeval world, and what I think in the introduction is called the postcolonial moment. No, the postcolonial, I cannot read and I cannot remember exactly. The postcolonial global time in which we live, which is a central element of that introduction. And each chapter, in their own ways, in very detailed, empirical, at times ethnographic ways, dissects and explains how that post-colonial global time is then rendered concrete in slums, in camps, in cities, in the middle of the sea. And I think more broadly this kind of galloping masks or put forward an analytical point, which is the one that Ranabir just made. Statelessness is not just about the global south or facile distinctions between global south and global north, should be certainly abandoned. It's not a policy problem that happens to racialized populations out there, but it's a condition. It's a condition that haunts us in Europe, in the street of Minneapolis, as I will try to suggest towards the end of my intervention, in Salvadorian prisons where Venezuelan migrants are deported, and so on, right? So that's the first important point. The second, I think, important point of the book or area of contribution is the kind of epistemological and methodological innovation that it brings. So I think the book is deeply committed to transdisciplinarity and to coloniality, but it does so in very interesting ways. So, across the book, in that galloping that I was talking about, you find, legal analysis of legal text together with, embodied accounts of personal experiences. You find discussions on novels, Sea of Poppy, Gauche, and whatnot, with, historical accounts of the constitution of nation states, the exclusion and inclusion of what were to be then called citizens and non-citizens, and so on. And so, on one side, this is a fresh perspective on the legalistic and policy-oriented field of statelessness, if we can call it as such. But I think it also speaks innovatively to some of the critical literature, specifically that on coloniality, which tends to resort to somewhat formulaic positions or trite argument. Here, the imperative to decolonize epistemology emerges from this conversation between various authors, each of which presents and discusses statelessness in their own way, through their own disciplinary gaze. And that is, to me, a very fresh take on, especially coming from the UK, on what coloniality may mean in academic terms. And actually, here I have a long note. I will just say, and this a lot we need to praise the editorial work of these three, because, that conversation emerges really well, and, each chapter in their own way, but each chapter does speak to the introductory chapter. So you get, a coherent whole, which, again, it's rare in many edited collections. But what I think is the real, contribution is the timeliness, and both Ayşe and Sabyasachi accounted for the context in which this book emerged, but I'm surprised that they didn't mention the fact that 2024, when the book was published, was supposedly the year in which we were to end statelessness. The I Belong, I think, UNHCR initiative ended in 2024. There was another global initiative to address, statelessness, and this was crucial. It was a crucial moment in which, in fact, it reminded me a lot of that moment at the end of the 1990s, when the humanitarian policy world was expecting the end of the refugee cycle. 2024 or the 2020s. The early 2020s were a moment in which statelessness was thought to be, addressed. It's about filling gaps. It's about creating legal instruments. Yes, the Dominican Republic just made a bunch of Haitians stateless by a decree, and yet we can address that. And I remember students in my master's always, in the hunt for jobs, poor souls, all writing dissertations about statelessness, because it was, where funding and policy ideas were going. And in that context, here come Sabyasachi, Ranabir, Ayşe say, no, sorry, you got it completely wrong. It's not about legal status. It's not about social reality fitting into the blueprint that law gives us. But it's the other way around. We need to start from social reality, from sites, from nuances, from contradictory lived experiences to understand what the law does. This is the production of statelessness that they were all referring to. So here, statelessness is not a glitch or an exception. It is, again, very much from my perspective, like borders and border studies. It is a social process. It's a social process that need to be studied in specific sites, in specific contexts. The quote-unquote stateless is not one end in a dichotomy between stateless and citizen, but rather statelessness is, in a sense, everything that is in between those two poles and extreme. And importantly, again, statelessness cannot be cured by the law, but actually, as Sabyasachi's chapter and the other three, in that the first section on law, I think, is fantastic. So I highly recommend reading it. But law is not the cure to statelessness, but it's actually, a foundational tool for it to be produced and created. And this reframing of the policy debate, brings the discussion on statelessness onto, topics that go well beyond refugees and, laws and administrative procedures and policies. It brings about precarity and abandonment, dispossession and exploitation, which are, running threads throughout the book, and yet very, very much absent from many policy discussions. It brings to the fore, as I was saying, an attention to the condition, to the de facto statelessness, regardless of legal status, and so broadens massively our understanding of who should we be concerned about, whether theorists or terrorists, as you wish to put it, but should be concerned about, and large swathes of population, and my research experience in Pakistan tells me nominal citizens, which actually are de facto stateless. This is a crucial contribution. As much as is the books and the volumes take on the concept of organized abandonment, which has been made popular currently, but it has long been in border abolitionist circles, but becomes really crucial in that take and in that perspective. And I think this, shift in emphasis is what makes the book timely beyond 2024. 2024 is yesterday, but it seems like another era. It seems decades and decades ago. I mean, it's been 2 years of televised genocide. We've now grown accustomed to deportations, voluntary return that are forced returns. And in fact, considering the debate on remigration and great replacement, I mean, a forced voluntary return seems like a great policy solution nowadays. And, we have grown accustomed to, border people deciding by the force of guns or checking at the very least, through the force of guns, through the violence force, who is a citizen, who is not. That de facto condition increasingly extends and expands beyond the migrant, non-migrant. It affects racialized populations who are nationals. I mean, the example of Windrush is clear, but it seems to continually expand. And, the killing by an ICE agent of a woman protester is, the latest example in this. So I'm going to stop, here with these three contributions, and I'm going to make a series of questions, maybe too many. You don't need to answer them, but for you to consider. So the first question, this I need to kind of have a look at. So the first set of questions, related to the conceptual categories. I mean, I think the book does a great job in, challenging, disrupting the citizen-stateless dichotomy, in emphasizing the process of production through dispossession, precarity, and violence. And so here, a broad set of questions would pertain to the question of whether these categories still have any analytical and or political traction, whether we should kind of leave that field altogether and always and more forcefully think about dispossession, exploitation, whether we should substitute that dichotomy with one premised on precarity and non-precarity and all of that. Perhaps a sub-theme within this line of thinking relates to the heterogeneity of who is contained within those dichotomies, whether you think about citizen and stateless or precarious and non-precarious. In other words, not all stateless people are the same, much like not all citizens are the same. And in fact, some of those that are rendered stateless may thrive in that condition, may reinforce and may reproduce further precarity to those further down the hierarchy and the bottom. So I wonder if you have comments on any of this. The second set of questions relates to sites. I mean, the book is fantastic in arguing that, it's about the production takes place in specific sites. And I wonder if you can explain how you chose those 3 sites, right? Obviously, I can intuitively see how the law, the sea, and cities are crucial in this respect, but arguably the borderland, the route, if we think about migration, could be equally interesting. So, how did you come to these 3 sites, and whether you feel that the process of production of statelessness is different in these 3 sites, or if we're simply witnessing the same process just being declined diversely. I'm hinting here at your active analytical units that you were suggesting in the talk. The third set of question is too long, but it refers to politics, to the what needs to be done, and what needs to be done. Again, in policy terms, whether we should abandon altogether the realm of policy making, but also in political terms. I mean, how can we transform these sites of production of statelessness into sites of solidarities? Where should we look for a grain of hope in these gloomy times? I'm going to leave it here.
Thank you very much, Paolo. It is, we will be here until long, I think, with these kind of questions, but they're very important and they're very good questions. And thanks a lot for this kind of reading of the book. And now I give the floor to Yuri to throw his comments and questions.
Thanks a lot. Let me start by thanking for the invitation. It was really very nice and a big opportunity to read and comment on the book. Also for being forced to read the book. Otherwise, I would have put the book on a very long pile of reading list. I will read it at some point. But having this event here forced me to read it now, and so thank you very much for that, really. Before I make some content-related comments, I would like to make a disclaimer, because very differently from all other people here on the stage, I'm a sociologist, I'm an urban sociologist, working on social policy, mainly at the European level. So with a very different approach, a neo-institutionalist approach. I'm conducting some ethnographic work as well, but very differently from anthropologists and ethnographers. So just to say that I probably will bring a very different disciplinary perspective into the field. However, I was very interested in the book and in the topic, because I'm actually also working about the relationship between policies and territories and their dialectic, their dynamic, and how they mutually influence one another, which brought me much closer to the book content than I initially actually thought. And because my theoretical and empirical interest is in the bordering process, in a way, how it gets structured, what consequences it has, and what consequences it has for people's lives and opportunities, in a way. And I have also a more personal and private interest. When I was born, already a long time ago, actually, my father was stateless. And he was a refugee from Bulgaria in Italy, and applying for citizenship for a long time, decades, and he never got citizenship. Actually, he got it, ironically, on the day of his funeral. That was quite strange. That was more than 60 years ago. And the world was very different. The Western world was in the golden age of a welfare state. We were supposed to have steady economic growth and increasing availability of resources. And this allowed the development of inclusive policies, of the availability of resources, of redistributive policies. So an increasing number of people, of groups, of social groups were accessing provisions, rights as well. at least in most European countries at that time. And migration flows were actually strongly encouraged at that time. And statelessness was a very different phenomenon like it is now. So the context, which you also refer to, everybody refers to, it's also time when something happens. So to be stateless 60 years ago is very different from being a stateless now. Just to give you another very personal example, at that time when I was the only foreigner among 1,200 pupils in my school. Now it's inconceivable, this situation. Now the world is different, and this book, I think, it's very important because it provides a decentered, very precious, decolonized account of how many things changed and the direction in which they changed, providing new meanings, not only to statelessness, but also new meanings to the migration flows and broadly conceived. Now, going briefly back to my research and how it relates to the book, I addressed the issue of bordering by considering the dialectics between jurisdictions and policies, in particular the way in which policies are designed and their institutional architecture and how they are territorially outreaching and including or excluding people. So the borders they are drawing not only physically but also socially. Who are the groups who are included? Who are the groups that are excluded? And this perspective is complemented by two other analytical elements which I think play an important role and which actually I found in the book also very prominent. So the contextual pressures, socioeconomic push and pull factors, political push factors, natural disasters, demographic factors, and many others, and politics. Politics, I think it's a very interesting element, seeks to address pressures, emerging issues within specific contexts through policies designed and implemented within specific jurisdictions. So there is a very complex interplay between these four analytical dimensions which produce the concrete case of statelessness, of migrations, of inclusion and exclusion. Now, how does this all connect to the book? What I got from reading the introduction and a few chapters, I have to admit I haven't read the whole book, is that different sides produce structural vulnerabilities shared by stateless individuals, but not only, by refugees, by migrants, and also by citizens. So citizens are not immune from exclusions and inclusions, in very different ways, however. And always, and this is the interesting contribution I was able to detect, showcasing intersecting levels of precarity. And in these sites, in these three sites, the law, the sea, and cities, various forms and degrees of vulnerability coexist. So that's the very important element. They coexist, they interact, and through this interaction, they produce very peculiar types of de facto statelessness or statelessness by itself. This reminded me very much of an article I read more than 20 years ago from a colleague, Lydia Morris, from the UK. She wrote about civic stratification to describe how different groups in society gain unequal access to rights, to benefits, to whatever. And she was inspired by David Lockwood, and his contribution was 96, more or less, who expanded actually on T.H. Marshall's idea of citizenship. So Marshall said citizenship is inclusive, is an equalizing force, and actually he was saying, yes, but it's also the opposite. Citizenship includes, but it excludes. And guess what? Some groups are systematically excluded somehow. And you put this also in your book very clearly. Legal infrastructures themselves also produce statelessness. So there is the double side of the coin, which is very important. And clearly, we need to go beyond the legal understanding of and embrace a more relational aspect. And sociologists, so this is my disciplinary competence somehow, they say this is a process of social construction of statelessness, where many aspects contribute quite substantially. So the legal aspects are an important part of that. power imbalances, colonial legacies, and many other aspects that should be brought into the picture, into the analytical picture, to understand how the process unfolds. To this, I would add one element which I didn't find in the book, but I think contributes substantially to draw these lines of inclusion and exclusion. And there is also a rapidly expanding literature on that. It's street-level bureaucracy. This literature, street-level bureaucracy, yes, goes beyond the legal framework because it looks into implementation, so how legal frameworks are implemented. And actually, implementation is equally important because it's not just about implementing one-to-one the law. Actually, you interpret, you adapt, you contrast even the law. You expand rights of people who don't have rights sometimes to include them, etc. And using different forms of discretion available in this translation exercise from law to practice. And actually, you refer in the book to practice, which I think it's a nice way of connecting these two elements. Because it helps to further differentiate the concept of statelessness. Okay. Because practice is a mechanism which enacts statelessness into reality. At our department of sociology, there is a colleague working actually precisely on this and showing how street-level bureaucrats contribute substantially to differentiate rights and producing de facto statelessness, disregarding the law by treating people from different origin in different ways. So not formally, but in practice. And this de facto statelessness, which I think is one of the interesting contributions of a book, among many others, is emerging from this dynamic of long-term displacement, highlighting also an active role of practices somehow. And this tension between the formal, the law, and the practice, I think is very interesting and needs to be somehow disentangled. Because, as you rightly put forward in the book, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless people are searching for rights to have rights. So the law plays an important role somehow. As you said at the beginning, it's a safe harbor somehow, if you have rights, and if you are able to claim rights somehow. It's as necessary but not sufficient condition somehow. The point is to understand the complex entanglements between rights or the lack of rights and the economy, culture, and politics somehow. And here the book, I think, makes a crucial contribution by decentering our analytical perspectives, because it advances a decolonial approach somehow, and we already moved beyond postcolonial, we decolonize our approaches. And to further complicate the landscape, you also introduce new technopolitics of border control and the use of algorithms, which I think it's the new frontier. Also face detection in China, and a lot of other, which are constructing illegalities and de facto statelessness. So technology is not an irrelevant factor, which is probably expanding at a very fast pace in recent developments, as you rightly put forward in the book. Also in the book you highlight how European states are increasingly using this control apparatus to justify citizenship deprivation and national security, on national security grounds. So legitimizing the use of these tools to exclude, to create this statelessness. So to what extent should national security concern override states' obligation under international law to prevent statelessness? Actually, this is surely a question open for debate. This also interestingly intersects with two elements which I think are very important, which have not been touched upon, but which I think can complement very nicely what you were talking, and actually it's in the book. The issue of legitimacy and the issue of deservingness somehow, and the ways in which these are constructed. We experience that very clearly with a recent inflow of Ukrainians who were treated very differently from Afghanis and Syrians, and not only formally but also in the practice. So I think it's an important element which shows how practices and formal laws can be interpreted against all. So I have a few questions also, with which I would like to end my brief comments. Actually, not so brief. So in the book, you are stretching the meaning of statelessness somehow, including intersecting precarious conditions and vulnerabilities beyond the legal definition, which I think it's a very important step forward in the debate. So what is, however, the value add of this exercise? Do you think that concepts of informality, of civic stratification, of segmented labor markets, of lacking rights and similar are not sufficient or are not sufficiently refined in grasping some very specific aspects of the condition of statelessness? I think your answer would be yes, we think the other concepts are not enough. There is a value added. So it would be nice if you could elaborate on that. And this question is also connected to another question on the relationship between precarious labor markets and the production of statelessness. So how can your theoretical framework better explain the mechanisms through which labor market conditions lead to de facto statelessness and increased vulnerability? Is it an issue of intersectionality of vulnerabilities? So being sex workers, you were mentioning them, very often the trafficking people take their passwords away, so they are stateless, de facto stateless, because their password have been taken away. So which multiple vulnerabilities, I lost my, so is it an issue of intersecting vulnerabilities in which multiple vulnerabilities are not summing up but multiplying their negative effects of people's opportunity structures? So how somehow this interaction of vulnerabilities is impeding a lot of opportunities of this specific group of people. And I have a very last question about methodology. Given that states produce statelessness also through citizenship laws, through border controls, through post-colonial practices somehow, what specific methodologies do you think are most effective in analyzing this shift from jus soli to jus sanguinis, or the juridification of citizenship, or the process of post-colonial territorialization? How is it possible to investigate them with innovative methodologies? So I stop here. I thank you very much. I learned a lot by reading that, so that was a very big and nice opportunity.
Thank you very much for your comments, and I think on the basis of those comments we have to write another or come up with another volume, because they were very profound and rich and asking substantial engagement with not only in terms of that refinement, but also in terms of rethinking of the, for example, what Paolo had brought up in terms of that the sites, but in terms of whether certain concepts are still useful or not, and the politics about. I think this is what Ranabir was also opening up, that it's a very important, that's kind of the politics is at the heart of it, heart of the matter. But I will pick up, if you allow me, I will pick up one from the Paula's question. If you want to pick up the others, I will just pick up in terms of the precarity, violence, and then whether that dispossession and then the exploitation do they have still value for that kind of analysis. And where actually in both of your comments that the precarity and vulnerability came up very high up, and this is also in the book. And there I would like to also not in terms of who is caught in terms of the precarity or not, and sorting out with the statelessness on citizenship, but I would refer to the cities as sites where this de facto statelessness is played out, where the, for example, the in the informal settlements, in terms of the slums, that what you see that very often the conditions of the line between the citizen and the citizens who are the long-term residents of the informal settlements and the refugees in the same place, where that line gets blurred in terms of their rightlessness. And the precarity and the vulnerability is a kind of the common ground where you do not, it becomes very difficult to analyze, to understand their livelihoods and relations on the basis of statelessness or as true citizenship. And this is, I think, this de facto statelessness. So it is another aspect of that, rather than not only focusing on terms of who is the citizen and who is not, who is the stateless, where there is a kind of a commonality appearing there. This has, I think, important political connotations in terms of not pitting people against each other, that they might create in terms of, and this is one of the articles with the Miraftab and Haq show in relation to Dhaka, and where that you see a similar kind of a sociability that is happening beyond those kinds of sorting out people in terms of their legal status and rightlessness, actually, that how the rightlessness is produced and brings them together. So, and this is a similar way of that Michel Agier looks at it on those instant cities. They are, in terms of, there is nothing to romanticize or praise about those kind of the conditions about rightlessness. But there is another side of it in those areas, what kind of the politics from those areas, from those sites could emerge. It has an important way. If you do not have this kind of an understanding of statelessness, you would not be able to see that kind of the politics. So this is the one of the political connotations. I mean, they are, you don't want to say, you want to get rid of the exploitation, but they are on their conditions of precarity is very much based on their dispossessiveness. I mean, they are all dispossessed in a way. That, of course, there might be the variations. And this is one of the, I think, I see as the merits of looking at the beyond those kind of legal definitions, where you could see the commonalities which are the basis of actually collective action. And I think we are all political animals as the editors, that we have that kind of an ambitions to see where the politics, and then Ranabir had written a lot on terms of politics from below in terms of those kind of sociabilities. So I will say that, I mean, that precarity and vulnerability, but this is, that comes through de facto rightlessness, and there that your citizenship status could become very meaningless. I would not abuse my role as the moderator. I would ask the others to, if you would like to pick up some of the questions, or you want to add certain things. Maybe Sabyasachi, that
No, I will come back to the issues of borders as raised by Paolo at one point of time. In fact, the fact is that, when we look at the territorialization of politics, And when we look at the post-colonial societies, the way the borders were being redrawn during decolonization, so that kind of bordering definitely created a situation of othering, and that created an inside also, where you also needed to identify the so-called outsiders. So now, as Yuri was pointing out, that the governance of borders, it has recently been being digitized and being controlled, being managed by algorithms, and therefore surveillance of these inner aliens and outsiders, that has also become more prominent. And when we look at the kind of precarity, the precarity is also related to this bordering and othering, and it is also related to the politics of nationhood. So that is important, probably, where we can elaborate more in further writings and research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Ranabir, would you like to pick up?
I think, sorry, we'll pick up the microphone.
Yeah.
My own, as I was listening to both of you, to Paolo's and Yuri's comment, let's say Paolo's question about whether as a concept, how much of it is validated when we link it to, as you said, to some of the conditions of existence, and or whether there is any other way. Am I right that you had? But also, see, there are, again, my answer would be a little crooked. A concept is something which is, all concepts are, that first of all, it doesn't easily give to a definition. The moment you want to define a concept, you have already lost some of it. And a concept is both a metaphor. All concepts are metaphors. At the same time, they also structurally form an idea. These are the two attributes of concept. What happens is that in formal academia, and particularly in the, how do you put it? Okay, in the formal academia or in the higher echelons of the knowledge industry, you always, meaning we, so please don't take it in a wrong way, we always give valence to what the idea scientifically, methodically given shape to. But we forget that that concept is much more powerful precisely because of the metaphor that it is congealing. So take statelessness, and I will give you one example, you will understand what I'm trying to tell. We may say that people are not worried about statelessness, they are much more worried about, let us say, their precarity, their dispossessed, that we should emphasize these things. But people are not moved by those things. In West Bengal, right at the moment, when we are sitting here, we have a special intensive revision of voters list going on. And if I am not wrong, about 30 to 35 people have committed suicide, including the registration officers, those who are in charge of returning the names of the returning officer, those who are in charge of registering. And there is a benchmark that those who had featured in 2002-2003 elections, electoral rolls, they are automatically, they will be in the 2025-26. But if they were not there, then there is a series of what you may call legacy documents that you have to prove that you are an Indian. The more this was being argued, the Supreme Court and the Election Commission, no, we are not revising citizenship. We are only deciding who is a voter. Look at the subterfuge. Fortunately, people are not trained in law. So they give a damn about these things. What they thought was that our basic right of existing as an Indian, the legal guarantee that we are Indians and we will not be killed, we will not be thrown out the borders, we may be Muslims, etc., etc. We may be minority, belonging to minority community or other immigrant communities, but they firmly stick to the idea. They hold it closest to their chest that only if we give vote, we prove that we are citizen. And in the fear that their names would be struck off, or their names had been struck off, or they are under so much pressure because when they work in the locality, people surround them and say, why are you striking off our names? So the opposite of the administration on the street is people on the street. You see, they decide how much of rights they will finally ensure for themselves. So there is always at the local level, to your question therefore, there is always a power contest going on that whether you will prevail on the street or we the crowd will prevail on the street. And as I said, this is the thing as age-old as democracy is. That it is your power on the street that will finally decide how many people, for how many days, under what conditions you will remain and occupy the street so that your guarantee of life, your life conditions are not taken away. So this is, as I wanted to, this is a much more biopolitical thing. Your fear that your identity as a national, your identity as citizen, all these are being taken away. This is physical fear. This is what Foucault would be calling in another context, that you have a new kind of politics, which is biopolitics. And this is not inscribed in the concept of citizenship, but the concept of citizenship to the people, or for that matter, stateless, to the people, the gesture is different, where your legal definition would not matter. From that, I can say, for me, which is why I said that we are still running behind the reality. We may say we have done a good book, which probably is, and I'm quite sure the book should sell well, and we haven't as yet got any money. But hopefully we'll one day, if the book becomes a bestseller. But we are still running behind the reality. Because the reality is, as I told you, narrated in what is happening in one far corner of the world, in a one small place called West Bengal. But the reality is that you have, as Ayşe was mentioning, why it is cities that become the site. So in choosing site, I have two, therefore, responses. And I must admit that, as you will understand, it was not designed. You see, much of the counter-theoretical work are always guerrilla work in theory and philosophy. Please understand. You never, nowhere, frontally, the established philosophy is attacked. They are, I'm not saying they are not. But most of the time, the attack begins against established notions of philosophy, whatever they are, always through the side. It is always through the periphery. The site of statelessness is nothing but a methodological question. How do you attack the established idea of statelessness? Would you go through and critique the laws? Would you go through and say, look, this is bad, this is wrong, this is how the stateless is to be defined? Or you seize on the difference between what you call to be the de facto and the de jure and say that, look, the more you look into the de jure, the more you look into de facto, the more de jure is unmasked or unclothed, that the king or the emperor has no clothes. But how do you tell that the emperor or the king has no clothes? It is only through the other way. So when you choose a site, you may always say there was one more site that has been left out. And I'm quite sure there are other important sites, Sabyasachi. So even though we have chosen 3 sites, but let's grant that there could be 3 more sites, equally valid. But the idea that you can critique a concept precisely by locating yourself as outliers, that you are on the periphery. And it is from those sites which people are not examining that you can show, look, this is what the concept is worth for. And this actually gives, in other words, this is my answer to both the things. And think of a very celebrated philosopher, Michel Foucault, when he writes on, let us say, madness in history, or the short text, etc. He was not writing directly anything on the shallow basis of what enlightenment is. He was only writing something what he later on would define as subversive history, or he has used several phrases. All he wrote was how madness was being treated, what he called the classical age, at the end of the classical age. But precisely that method itself, that you pick up certain what you call the subjugated histories, that you will always be able to interrogate what is considered as the established history. So picking up site is more a question of method. Once you decide that that is the best route to approach the problem. This is a guerrilla route, as I say. This is a subversive route.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ranabir. I know that the time is late, and we have taken quite a lot of time, and but I would still take one or two questions if you have, because I would feel really very frustrated if there would not be. I mean, I know that we were not able to do fairness to the very rich and long list of questions both Yuri and Paolo gave, but I think you got the gist of how we would be, in a way, tackling them and then responding those questions. And I'm really happy to be in a kind of a very much an agreement of what all of us had said, that's as the editors. But do you have, but let's take one or two questions from you, if you have, it's a long day, but if you have questions, we would be happy to hear. Yeah, Jeff.
Thank you so much for all of these comments, and it's great to learn about the book. I have maybe just a few short things that I wanted to mention, just a few quick questions, I think. One is, I guess maybe to put it a little bit heavy-handedly, as we've explored the sort of political conditions around statelessness, I wonder if we could pick up even a little bit more on this question of kind of like precarity, labor markets, the vulnerabilities that come from there, and ask whether there are also sort of structural, economic, we could imagine maybe a sort of relatively heavy-handed kind of economistic account of statelessness, right? Having to do with dynamics of exclusion in labor markets, right? Informalization, right? To what extent would we understand this as one of the sort of driving forces in the kind of increase of statelessness, right? I mean, we've discussed about some of the kind of legacies and genealogies of statelessness, but why is it that in the past, I don't know, 10, 20, or perhaps longer years, we've seen sort of more and more statelessness, right? Is there something around sort of capitalist transformations in which sort of fewer and fewer people are sort of immediately relevant to the production process that is sort of relevant to that discussion? That's one. Two, very simply, I'm just curious about C's, your third site. I'd just be curious if there's a minute or two to say a little bit about, we've heard about laws in cities, but a little bit about C's. And thirdly, I don't know, I'm just thinking, I've been struck, for instance, in my own work about some of the parallels between two relatively prominent sites of statelessness, which would be Palestinians and Rohingyas, and how to make sense of some of these sort of prominent sites within sort of common frames of analysis that might produce maybe sites of solidarity. So I've been thinking about Andreas Malm's work around fossil empire and how there are sort of some common structural conditions that might put some of these apparently isolated places together in sort of political terms. I don't know. I don't know if there's more to say about that. I'm struck as well when I've raised this in the past. People always want to. The question of Palestine and Myanmar, for instance, is always sort of religiously overdetermined, right? We've been talking about sort of race and racialization. I wonder, is it relevant, the question of sort of Islam, anti-Islam in South and Southern Asia, in the Middle East, in the so-called migration crisis? To what extent is that a sort of, does it make sense to think of that as a religious question of statelessness or racialization question? Just to sort of, I don't know, sort of loosely, that third question is still hanging for me somehow.
Okay. Let's collect the questions. I mean, there's already 3 there, but...
I will try to be a little bit telegraphic. So in Bangladesh, there's hundreds of thousands of people who are perceived as displaced people. They are not a part of the category of the refugees even. And I'm curious, it's a more global question, why the countries in Southeast Asia ignore this principle or try not to employ this principle of naturalization? So is it some sort of colonial legacy or something else?
Okay. Would you like to pick that question in terms of that with Bangladesh?
Well, with Bangladesh, I would say that yes, there are people who are not considered as stateless, not the Rohingyas, but other people are there. And one more thing is that it is not colonial really. In fact, you also have to remember that South and Southeast Asia, these countries, I mean, they have huge population. And therefore, this naturalization process is not really favored by the concerned states, one of the reasons. And with regard to another issue, that means, I mean, the way this kind of stateless population in a way is required in this era of neoliberal capitalism, their invisibilization that helps to turn them into the underclass of different informal economies, in the sense that they are employed in agriculture and plantation and some other sectors, maybe service sectors, and they cannot demand, they cannot claim really their fair wages and everything. So there is also a political economy approach apart from this kind of legal kind of categorization that we have been familiar with.
Okay, do you want to... I wonder, yeah, okay. Oh.
Quick responses, but thanks that you raised them. One is that on the sea thing, my own understanding is that this perhaps is or can be, for a later work, most adventurous kind of thing in exploring statelessness, and which has been relatively less explored in the literature on statelessness. And historically, it is the most productive. There is a new argument, in fact, that Carl Schmitt wrote about nomos of the earth. So Carl Schmitt's entire idea were laws were art-centric. But what happens when you think of human mobility on the sea? There the laws of the earth do not function in the way that they function elsewhere. So if you think of penitentiary, the prison islands, to give one example, but one can go on. If you think of, at least the knowledge that I have of Indian Ocean, I do not have, but I have a little bit on the Atlantic also. So these seas have been not only the exploiting, exploiting ground or the exploiting space for the outlaws. In fact, New York Times carried an 18 installment series titled as Outlaw Ocean, of how the oceans and the seas are used for doing this. So I think your question is very good, and there has to be much more work on what we are doing. On the economy thing, I have a stronger observation, which is that it coincides with the neoliberal era in world capitalism. And we are so much used to, once again, pardon my, again bringing in the question of having a southern view. Global capitalism, we see always that labor contract, contractual labor, labor laws, labor protection, etc. Factory report, all that you get in Marx. But precisely at the time when capitalism was learning that the labor market has to be protected through welfare legislation, which culminates in, as he rightly pointed out, Marshall's idea of social citizenship. But precisely at the time, most of the world's laboring population were immigrant population. What happened to indentured labor? So labor without citizenship was the normal thing. And labor with citizenship rights, if you think of it globally, is an abnormal, exceptional thing. It happened only in few. So we have to completely inverse. So in a way, it's this old famous book, World Turned Upside Down. We have to turn upside down the way we look at it. Because in most of labor's history, labor did not have these rights. And once again, labor has gone back to its old history, which is that you can go on labor without having the citizenship rights. So the more you have scattered forms of labor, informal labor, where formal industries are also resorting to informal modes of production and labor market operation, which is why I mentioned sex work as one of the prime examples of how one of the biggest part of the entertainment industry, global entertainment, is going on. So labor without rights is the normal. And world is going back to that. And it is happening the more you have a neoliberal reorientation of global economy.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Ranabir. I would just like to add to that in terms of the Cs, because in a way that the Cs is very, I think there has to be more work to be done on that. I agree on that. But Cs create zones of legal exception and legal ambiguity and limbo in a different way. That is in terms of the fragmentation of jurisdiction there. And think of that it is not only that this kind of legal ambiguity and legal exceptions, zones of legal exceptions, of course it connects immediately to the labor, but we could also think about shadow fleets. That is, it is very much up in today's debates, and the shadow fleets have been there. And it is exactly the shadow fleets is a very good way of seeing, I think, in terms of how seas could create that kind of legal limbo, in a way, the ambiguity, where it is always used, that is in the book, that the article, that one of the articles looks at it, what happens, how de facto, the moment they are on that ship, these workers become stateless because they are not, in terms of the legally connected to those. So I think there is that one other point related to that. In terms of the kind of the religion, I mean, it depends on which criteria will be at that. It's a very conjunctural issue, I think. I would respond it that way. It could be in the questions about the Rohingya and then the Palestinians. I mean, within this conjuncture, that I think that the particular religion comes up for this precarity, vulnerability, but there is not a necessity for that, except this is how those kind of racializations and not even exclusion about abandonment and take place. I would respond that way. Okay.
I
Do
think,
you,
Ayşe, your point is absolutely right in the sense that it is the, I mean, when you speak of conjunctural analysis, that certain conjunctures produce what we call statelessness. So there is no general guiding principle or general law as to this is how, this is statelessness, this is not. But precisely where she is right is that it is a conjuncture of certain circumstances that may then produce a particular religious community as the persecuted sect in a particular area. But what is interesting is that all these persecuted are all, they are now known as the stateless. That's the final result. So which is why I said that on one hand you have a conjunctural mode in which certain dispossessed people are being created. But on the other hand, you have already a concept which is gesturing at certain, again, Hannah Arendt's word, that the human condition. What is the condition that you allude to, that you gesture towards through the term that you are, or through the concept that you are using?
I think, unfortunately, we have to finish. We are already over our time. And thank you, first of all, thank you very much for your comments, and then we have to really work on them, and your questions, and quite a lot. Sorry that if we were not able to do justice to all of them. And thank you very much for your comments, and thank you very much being with us in this conversation. Thank you.